The Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan. Picture a perfect spring morning. After years of struggle, after relentless winds and choking grit, the sky finally breaks clear. The sun warms your face. The air feels clean, and for the first time in what feels like forever, there's actual peace. It's Palm Sunday, April 14th, 1935. In the small towns dotting the southern plains, places like Boise City, Oklahoma, and Dalhart, Texas, families are heading to church. Children are playing outside without masks covering their faces. People are finally allowing themselves to hope. They're whispering to each other, maybe the worst is behind us. Then, right in the middle of the afternoon, someone glances toward the horizon and sees something coming. It's not a rain cloud, it's a wall. A boiling, churning wall of blackness, towering 1,000 feet high, barreling forward faster than any train. The birds sense it before the people do. They scatter in a screeching panic. The air becomes so charged with static electricity it can literally knock a grown man off his feet. Then, just like that, the sun disappears. The world plunges into complete darkness. Not dusk, not twilight, but a deep and terrifying blackness, as if someone just snuffed out the sun like a candle. They called it Black Sunday. A single storm that carried twice as much dirt as was excavated to build the entire Panama Canal. This one horrifying afternoon was the peak of a decade-long catastrophe, a disaster made by human hands known as the Dust Bowl. It's a story we think we know from grainy photographs in history books. But what if I told you there's so much more? What if I told you it's one of the most powerful tales ever told about ambition, pride, and the terrifying consequences of believing we can actually conquer nature? Today we're diving into The Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan. This isn't just another book, it's a testament to survival. It won the National Book Award, and once you hear this story, you'll understand why. Egan doesn't just recite facts at you. He brings back the voices of the people who stayed, that stubborn 2/3 of the population who endured what should have been unendurable. By the time we're done, you'll understand how the greatest grassland on the planet got turned completely inside out, unleashing a decade of ecological terror. But even more importantly, you'll meet the people who stared into the face of that terror and absolutely refused to blink. Their story teaches us what real resilience looks like, what it truly means to call a place home, and why their warnings from generations ago still echo so powerfully in our world right now. Our story doesn't start with dust. It starts with a promise of land, of independence, of starting fresh. In the early 1900s, the southern Great Plains, the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, chunks of Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, was one of America's last frontiers. People called it no man's land. This vast, treeless ocean of grass that had been home to millions of bison and the Comanche tribes who hunted them. Early explorers had labeled it the Great American Desert, basically declaring it worthless for farming. But by the turn of the century, that narrative was shifting. The government and railroad companies, desperate to settle every inch of the continent, started selling a completely different dream. This wasn't a desert at all, they insisted. It was paradise waiting to happen. All you had to do was plow it up. They preached this powerful and, as it turned out, incredibly dangerous idea. Rain follows the plow. Just the simple act of breaking up the sod, they claimed, would actually change the climate, bringing moisture to this dry land. And people came in droves. The last chancers, folks who had missed out on every other land rush in history. Families from worn-out farms in the South, German immigrants from the Russian steppes, cowboys watching their open range vanish before their eyes. They all wanted the same thing, a piece of the world to finally call their own. Among them was a guy named Bam White. Bam was a genuine cowboy, a horseman with a handlebar mustache, who honestly seemed like he was born in the wrong century. The great ranches were getting carved up and sold to farmers. In the winter of 1926, he was moving his family in a beaten-up wagon from Colorado to Texas. searching for any work he could find. But right in the middle of no man's land, one of his horses just died. They were completely stranded. He had no idea then, but fate had just dropped him right in what would become ground zero of the Dust Bowl, the town of Dalhart, Texas. Dalhart was booming, built entirely on wheat's promise. It had an actual opera house, electric streetlights, and characters like Uncle Dick Coon, a town boss who loved flashing $100 bills around. It practically hummed with the feverish optimism of the Roaring Twenties. Not far away, in the Oklahoma Panhandle, families like the Lucases were literally carving homes out of the prairie itself. A young girl named Hazel Lucas grew up in a dugout, an actual home dug into the earth, with a dirt floor and walls they had to douse with boiling water just to kill the bugs crawling around. For Hazel and thousands like her, the draw was simple: free land. The Enlarged Homestead Act offered 320 acres to anyone willing to prove up on it. And then there were the Germans from Russia, families like the Ehrlichs. These were expert dryland farmers who'd been lured to the Russian steppes a century earlier by Catherine the Great, only to flee when the Tsar started trying to draft their sons into his army. They came to America carrying the seeds of what they called a miracle crop, Turkey red wheat, a tough winter grain that could actually survive in dry country. These were hardened, resilient people who knew hardship intimately. They believed they'd finally found their permanent home. For a while, honestly, the dream seemed completely real. The 1920s brought unusually wet years. The plows, pulled first by sweating mules and then by amazing new tractors, just tore through that ancient sod. The native buffalo grass, with roots that had held the soil together for 35,000 years, got flipped upside down. The old-time cowboys, guys like Bam White, watched in absolute horror. They had this saying, "The best side is up." They warned these farmers not to plow it under, that this land was only good for one thing: growing grass. But nobody bothered listening. Wheat prices were absolutely soaring, driven by World War I and a government guarantee of $2 a bushel. A farmer could make an actual fortune. Why on earth would you listen to some cowboy when machinery was the new miracle everyone believed in? The Great Plow-Up became a total frenzy. In just 5 years, from 1925 to 1930, farmers in the southern plains ripped up an area the size of 2 Yellowstone national parks. They were betting absolutely everything on wheat and the hope that the rain would just keep coming. And then it stopped. The betrayal didn't start in the sky. It started on Wall Street. The stock market crash of 1929 sent shockwaves rippling across the entire country. The price of wheat, which had been the foundation holding up this whole prairie empire, just collapsed. It plummeted from $2 a bushel to 75 cents. Then 50, then a pathetic 25. Farmers were completely trapped. They'd taken out loans to buy those tractors and more land. The only way to make the same amount of money was to produce even more wheat. So they did the only thing they could think of. They plowed up even more grass. They left millions of acres of land sitting there naked, completely exposed and vulnerable, right as those wet years came to an abrupt end. The drought started in 1931. This wasn't just a dry summer, it was a profound absence of rain that would drag on for nearly a decade. The earth, with no grass holding it together, began to fundamentally change. The soil calcified, turning into this fine, lifeless powder. And then the wind, which had always been a constant companion on the plains, started picking it up. The first dust storms were almost curiosities. People called them dusters or sandstorms. But they quickly became something else entirely. In January of 1932, a cloud 10,000 feet high rolled over the Texas Panhandle. It wasn't beige like beach sand. It was black. People had literally never seen anything like it. It moved like an entire mountain range on the march. When it finally passed, it left this coating of fine black silt on absolutely everything. People would blow their noses and find black snot. That was just the beginning. The land had turned against them. By 1934, the Dust Bowl had entered this new and absolutely terrifying phase. Life became a daily battle just to breathe. The dust was completely inescapable. It seeped through every single crack, under doors, through windows people had taped shut. Housewives would wake up to find the only clean spot on their pillow was the exact outline of where their head had been. They'd set the dinner table with all the plates turned upside down, flipping them over only at the very moment they served food, otherwise it'd be covered in a layer of grit. A scoop shovel became standard household equipment, needed just to clean the house every morning. The static electricity the dust generated was so intense it could knock two people flat on the ground if they just shook hands. Blue flames would actually dance along barbed wire fences. Car engines shorted out constantly. People tied ropes from their house to the barn, just to make it a few hundred feet without getting completely lost in the blinding blackness. Chickens would go to roost in the middle of the afternoon, genuinely thinking night had fallen. And then came the sickness. Doctors started seeing this new condition they named dust pneumonia. The fine, silica-heavy dust basically tore at people's lungs, creating something similar to what coal miners suffered, except it developed in just a few years instead of decades. Children and elderly folks were hit the hardest. They'd start with this hacking cough and a fever, and within just days, some of them were dead. The Red Cross actually started handing out respiratory masks to schools. In this heartbreaking twist of irony, the High Plains, once promoted as this perfect haven for lungers, people with breathing problems seeking clean, dry air, had become a place where simply breathing was dangerous. Jean Clark was just a little girl then. Her mother, Louise, had been a Broadway dancer who'd moved to Colorado specifically, quote, for the air, to cure her own breathing issues. Now her daughter was dying from it. After one of the big storms, 8-year-old Jeanne just couldn't stop coughing. They diagnosed her with dust pneumonia, what people were calling the brown plague. The doctor told them she might not survive. The natural world seemed like it was completely coming apart. Plagues of grasshoppers descended in clouds so thick they literally blotted out the sun, devouring everything they touched: crops, garden vegetables, the wooden handles of farm tools, even the clothes off scarecrows. And then came the rabbits. With all their natural predators gone, jackrabbits multiplied into the millions. In this desperate and honestly brutal response, towns organized what they called rabbit drives. Thousands of people would form this huge perimeter and, armed with clubs and baseball bats, would herd the rabbits into a pen and just bash their skulls in. Melt-White, Bam's son, snuck out to watch one of these drives. The sound of those clubs, the screaming of the animals, it gave him nightmares for the rest of his entire life. The social fabric was literally tearing apart. Banks failed, wiping out people's entire life savings. Farmers who couldn't scrape together their taxes faced foreclosure. In some towns, they organized these penny auctions, where neighbors would basically intimidate any outside bidders, buy back a foreclosed farm for just a few cents, and give it right back to the original owner. It was this act of communal defiance. But the absolute worst was still coming. April 14th, 1935. Black Sunday. That was the day the beautiful morning transformed into a living nightmare. The storm that started way up in the Dakotas just gathered strength as it rolled south, picking up millions of tons of loose topsoil from Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado. By the time it reached the Oklahoma Panhandle, it was this solid wall of black, 200 miles wide, moving at 60 miles an hour. Ike Osteen, this boy who'd grown up in a dugout in Baca County, was out driving with friends. He saw the birds and rabbits fleeing in absolute terror. He looked north and saw this boiling mountain coming straight for them. They made a dash for a nearby farmhouse just as the wall slammed into them. They got thrown to the ground, completely engulfed in this roaring, scraping blackness. Inside the house, it got so dark. Ike literally couldn't see his own hand right in front of his face. The Lucas family was out on the road in a funeral procession for Hazel's grandmother, Lumisa, who had died just hours after Hazel's baby, Ruth Nell. They saw the storm bearing down and circled their cars like some kind of wagon train, putting the hearse right in the middle. They pressed wet handkerchiefs over their faces and huddled under the vehicles as the entire world just disappeared. For over an hour, they were trapped in that roaring, suffocating darkness. Woody Guthrie, still just a young, unknown folk singer in Pampa, Texas, was in a room with a bunch of people when the duster hit. Someone actually cried out, "It's the end of the world!" Guthrie just picked up his guitar. Right there, in that moment of pure terror, he wrote the opening lines of a song that would become the anthem of that entire era. "So long, it's been good to know you." Black Sunday was the real turning point. It finally grabbed the nation's attention. A few days later, as Hugh Hammond Bennett, the passionate head of this new soil erosion service, was testifying before a pretty skeptical Congress in Washington, D.C., he pulled off a bit of perfect theater. Knowing the dust cloud was heading east, he deliberately stalled his testimony. As he kept talking, the sky over the Capitol started to darken. The senators got up and walked to the window, watching in complete disbelief as this yellow-brown haze settled over the city, blocking out the sun entirely. "This, gentlemen," Bennett said calmly, "is what I'm talking about. There goes Oklahoma." He got his funding. The New Deal finally started responding with real force. President Franklin Roosevelt, a man who truly believed in taking action, launched this two-pronged attack. One plan, pushed hard by Secretary of the Interior Harold Ikes, was essentially to just surrender. The government would buy back millions of acres of this ruined farmland, officially declare the settlement of the plains a complete failure, and relocate the people. It was basically a plan for managed retreat. The other approach, championed by Bennett and Roosevelt himself, was to actually fight back. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, sent an entire army of young men into the Dust Bowl. They launched Operation Dust Bowl, the largest soil conservation project in American history. They taught farmers completely new techniques like contour plowing to hold the soil in place. They started this monumental task of trying to reseed the prairie, planting millions of acres of grass. And Roosevelt had his own big idea, the Shelter Belt Project. He envisioned this great wall of trees, 100 miles wide, running 1,000 miles from Canada all the way down to Texas, to break the wind and literally change the climate of the plains. Critics thought he was absolutely crazy. If God wanted trees on the Great Plains, they sneered, he would have put them there himself. But Roosevelt kept pushing, and his crews ended up planting over 200 million trees. In Dalhart, this fiery newspaper editor named John L. McCarty completely rejected any notion of retreat. He saw the government's resettlement plans as a total insult to the pioneers who'd built up the plains. In defiance, he formed the Last Man Club, printing up membership cards for anyone who'd pledged to stay until hell freezes over. The first members were the town's elite, Uncle Dick Coon, Doc Dawson, and a whole bunch of ranchers and businessmen. They were Spartans, McCarty declared proudly, and they absolutely would not abandon their homes. But even as they made these bold declarations, the land grew more and more desperate. People turned to rainmakers, paying some guy named Tex Thornton hundreds of dollars to fire TNT and dynamite into the sky, hoping the explosions would somehow shake loose some moisture. The blasts thundered over Dalhart for days on end. All they got for it was more dust. The years just ground on and on. 1936, 1937, 1938. The drought wouldn't break. The dusters kept coming. The government cattle-killing program became one of the most surreal episodes of the whole thing. With absolutely no grass left to eat, millions of cattle were literally starving to death. So the government paid farmers a few dollars a head for their entire herds. The healthiest animals were butchered and the meat sent to relief agencies. The rest, the sickest, most emaciated creatures, were just shot and buried in these massive graves. Cowboys like Bam White got hired to do the killing. A man who'd spent his entire life caring for cattle now spent his days shooting them in the head, one after another. The work absolutely broke his spirit. This government documentary film, The Plow That Broke the Plains, made Bam the unwitting star. His weathered face, guiding an old horse-drawn plow, became the national image of the farmer who had, according to the film's narrative, destroyed the land. People in his own town started treating him like a traitor. In 1938, with his body broken and his will completely gone, Bam White died. His family was left with absolutely nothing. Slowly, almost too gradually to notice, things started to shift. The conservation efforts were beginning to make a small difference. The furrows and the newly planted grasses started holding the soil just a little bit better. The dusters of 1938, while still coming regularly, weren't quite as apocalyptic as the monsters of 1935. And then, in the summer of 1938, President Roosevelt actually came to visit Amarillo, Texas, right in the heart of Dust Bowl country. 100,000 people gathered to see him, the man they genuinely believed was their savior. As his train pulled into town, something miraculous happened. It started to rain. Not some muddy, dusty shower, but real, clean, honest-to-God rain. Roosevelt rode through the streets in an open car, hatless, just smiling as the rain streamed down his face. He stood before this drenched, cheering crowd. "I think this little shower we have had," he told them, "is a mighty good omen." And it was. The long drought was finally breaking. The rains came back, not all at once, but enough. With the outbreak of World War II, wheat prices shot up again. Fields that had been completely barren for a decade turned green. The Dust Bowl, as this distinct historical event, was finally over. But the land, and the people who'd survived it, were changed forever. So what do we actually take away from this incredible story? It's tempting to look back on the Dust Bowl as this distant, almost mythological tragedy. A perfect storm where economic collapse met terrible weather. But what Timothy Egan brilliantly reveals is that it wasn't a natural disaster at all. It was completely human-made. The people who settled the plains weren't evil or stupid. They were ambitious, hopeful, and incredibly tough. They were genuinely chasing the American dream. But they were guided by this fatal sense of pride. They truly believed they could bend the land to their will, that technology and sheer determination could conquer absolutely any obstacle. They completely ignored the wisdom of the past, the wisdom of cowboys who actually understood the grass, and the deeper wisdom of the land itself, which had spent thousands of years perfecting an ecosystem specifically designed to handle drought and wind. This story delivers a powerful, humbling lesson about consequences. It reminds us that our relationship with the natural world has to be a partnership, not a conquest. When we take more than the land can possibly give, when we ignore its most fundamental rules, the land will eventually push back. And trust me, its power is way, way greater than our own. But the worst hard time isn't just a cautionary tale about what not to do. It's also one of the most profound stories of human resilience you'll ever encounter. Just think about it. 2/3 of the people stayed. They didn't pack up and leave. They endured a full decade of what can only honestly be described as hell on earth. They watched their children die, their farms literally blow away, their hopes turn to dust in their hands. So why did they stay? For some, honestly, it was just a lack of options. They had nowhere else to go, no money to get there. But for many others, it was something much deeper. It was this loyalty to a place, this stubborn refusal to be beaten down. It was this belief, however battered and bruised, in next year. That's what they called it, next year country. This faith that things absolutely had to get better, because they literally couldn't possibly get any worse. Their story forces us to ask ourselves some hard questions. What's our own connection to the places we call home? What would we be willing to endure for them? And what do we actually owe to the land that sustains us? The witnesses of the Dust Bowl, people like Ike Osteen, Hazel Shaw, and Melt White, didn't just happen to live through history. They became its living memory. Their voices, captured so beautifully by Egan, are honestly a gift. They remind us that the past is never truly past, never really behind us. The Ogallala Aquifer, that vast underground ocean that allows farming to continue on the plains today, is being drained 8 times faster than nature can possibly replenish it. The lessons of the dust are still right there, just waiting for us to finally listen. That was a summary of The Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan. We've journeyed through the big ideas and the powerful stories together today. But here's the thing. A summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. The real experience only comes from actually walking the terrain yourself. The true magic of this book lives in the details, in those quiet, heartbreaking moments when you really connect with a homesteader's letter or a cowboy's fading memory. This summary is your map, just to help you decide if this particular journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about today has stirred something in you, I really encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just learning some history. It's an experience that will genuinely change how you see the land, your country, and the enduring power of the human spirit. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if this summary has brought you any value at all, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. It tells us we're on the right track, and make sure you won't miss our next exploration of another potentially life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.